Hello, friends. I am Chevy. Welcome to my shed. How are you today? How's life in your world? How's things where you are? I hope it's fantastic. Everything here is great. The workbench is getting crowded. I got this in the mail yesterday, which I think I might try to film it and then do it not as a video for itself, but as an episode. This is something for my miter soul. But I brought the Kindle down because today we're going to talk about a book. My word, I've been reading a lot today. Not today. Not I haven't read it all today, actually. Been reading a lot this month. Today we're talking about another Stephen King book called If It Bleeds. I talked about this in the episode where I talked about Holly, because this is a collection of short stories, four stories, a novella and four short stories. And one of those stories was featuring the Holly Gibney character, which I read. So I started reading Holly. It started referencing this novella, and so I went and read the novella. And I thought I wasn't going to finish. I'll come back to this book someday. But I went ahead and finished it because the novella was a massive chunk of the book, and the other three stories were smaller. I said I wasn't going to review it because whatever, but I actually am. And the reason I'm going to review it is because I really enjoyed the last story, which most people would put at the bottom of their list for a Stephen King book. But I really enjoyed that story for a very specific reason, which we'll get to when we get there. Let's talk about the stories, I guess, individually. I'm going to keep this. I'm going to try to keep this as spoiler free as possible. There's not a lot to spoil in any of these stories. So if you're going to read some shorter fiction, sure, you could read this. But I feel like if you're going to read the Holly story in here, you kind of need to read the other stuff or it won't make a lot of sense. So I think the only people who are going to pick this up probably already did. I'm reviewing something that I don't think you're going to just stumble upon in the future. So there's probably going to be some spoilers in here. But again, I don't really think it's that spoilery. The first story is called Mr. Harrigan's Phone, and I found it to be thought-provoking. It's a story about a young boy and an older gentleman who is a successful businessman who moves into the area, like kind of moves out of the city, moves into the area. Very wealthy man, and hires the boy to read to him because the boy was a good auteur. And they end up having a bond, and when the old man dies... the old man was kind of a, what do you call the person that, there's a word for, and he uses it in here. There's a word for people who don't do technology. A Luddite? Yeah, a Luddite. He's a Luddite, and so he doesn't have TV or whatever. He just has a landline phone, that sort of stuff. The boy ends up buying him an iPhone and showing him how to use it to track the Dow Jones, or the Dow, I guess. And the man ends up, like, whatever. So the story is kind of a bit of a ghost story in the end, kind of a bit of a sentiment story. It's a little bit of an exploration on a greed, I guess. It's hard to say that because the man ends up leaving the boy. The boy's father calls the man greedy because he doesn't spend money. He sends him like $1 scratch off tickets for his birthday, like a single $1 scratch off. But the man ends up leaving the boy a significant trust for college and that sort of stuff. And then the real story comes, after the man dies and the boy discovers he still has this connection with the man and uses that connection for not so, like, for greedy means, for so it's a little bit of a like, oh, did I mean to do that sort of thing. Interesting little story. It was a good read. I enjoyed reading it. The second story is called The Life of Chuck, and I thought this was kind of hilarious. I really enjoyed the premise. I read an article or an interview with Stephen where he talked about just having this idea about this billboard saying, like, congratulations, Chuck, thank you for 39 wonderful years or whatever. And thinking, what would that be? And so this story is told in three parts of Chuck's life. And it's told in reverse order. So the end of his life, the middle of his life, and the beginning of his life. And I really found it fascinating because it really makes you stop and think, it made me stop and think. I'm going to go ahead. I think that there's not really any. The main idea is there's a whole world that lives inside your head, right? That's just your imagination, things that you've picked up and remembered over the years. All of these people and places and events are still living in your head. And when you die, they die too. That's kind of it. That's kind of it. But it's told in three really thoughtful and kind of loving parts that I thought were really interesting. I don't. It's definitely not something that I want to say, hey, you need to go read this because I didn't think it was that thought provoking. But it was just kind of a comfortable read. It was enjoyable. Even though it touched on death and it touched on some hard feelings, it did it with grace, and I like that. I like that sort of thing. The third story was If It Bleeds. That's the story featuring Holly Gibney. This is a sequel to The Outsider. If you've read The Outsider, similar sort of villain, not exactly the same, slightly different. A sort of a similar approach to that case, but except, sometimes I think that the Holly stories, well, that's not fair. The book Holly, and this book, If It Bleeds, should really be the Barbara and Jerome stories. They just feature Holly, right? I think they end up being central, or they end up being not MacGuffins, but they end up being plot devices for Holly's stories, and that's definitely the case here. It was I enjoyed the read because I'm working on a shorter story, like a novella-sized story, and I wanted to see how Stephen King handles that sort of pacing because he generally tends to be an overwriter. He tends to write just a lot of fluff and a lot of fill and a lot of extra, and I wanted to see how he would pare that down, how he would. I shouldn't say fluff. He dramatizes everything. And so you can't really do that if you're only writing 30,000 words. You kind of have to summarize and move on. And I wanted to see how he handled it. So I enjoyed it for that. The story itself I felt was a little weak and a little flimsy, but it worked. It moved Holly's character along a little bit. And it tied some gaps between The Outsiders and the book Holly. So there you go. So the last story is called Rat. I very, very, very much enjoyed this story. It is definitely not people's favorite in the book. It's probably low on most people's Stephen King list because it's not particularly horrific. It's not particularly scary. There's not really anything. It's kind of a comedy in some ways. It's kind of a fairy tale in other ways. But the reason I enjoyed it is because it's about a man trying to write a book. And I didn't know that until I started reading it. But it's literally a man trying to write a book. He goes off into the woods. Like that classic trope of the writer needing to get away and write for a month into the woods. So he does that. Bad things happen. Nothing serious. And then the fairy tale happens, right? The fairy tale of this is the spoiler. The fairy tale of the genie, right? Except in this case, it's a rat. He ends up saving a rat's life, and that rat grants his wish. His wish is to write this book. He gets stuck. He wants to write the book. The rat says, "I'll let you write the book if somebody close to you dies." And then they negotiate on that, who that person is, and in the end, the rat picks a person who's dying of pancreatic cancer anyway, and so the author says sure, and he writes his book, and it sells for hundreds of thousands of dollars, and he's now a successfully published author, and then of course the death doesn't happen the way he expected because these fairy tales never work out that way, and then he goes back to confront the rat or whatever. It's a very lighthearted story except for the whole killing thing. But it was Stephen King went really deep into the head of the author, and we got to see him struggle to put words together. We got to see him struggle to piece plot together. We got to see him. We got to see his reaction to his family when they were like, "Oh God, not again! Why do you need to write this stupid book? Can you just give up on the whole writing thing?" And he's like, "I can't. It's just part of who I am. I have to do this." It all felt so familiar. It felt like I was just. It was me, right? Other than the whole going off into the woods, I'm not going to do that. But it felt just like, oh yes, this is the stuff that I struggle with. Today I wrote, I got maybe 300 words in. It was just a quick like half-hour session that I had time for, and I struggled. Like there was times I'm looking stuff up on thesaurus.com. Like, why am I doing that? This is just a first draft. Just get it out. But I can't. Like, I'm struggling to piece this together in a cohesive way, and that was like in this story. This story was that. This story was the writer trying to make sense of the writing process, and it was fun. It was just really fun to read. So it gave me a little bit of like, yeah, not just justification, but it gave me a little, it's one of those situations when you think there's something wrong with you, and then you hear somebody spell it out. You go, oh, okay, so it's not my imagination. This is a thing, and I just need to figure out how to overcome it. That was that story, and that's the reason why I liked it, and that's the reason why I wanted to talk about this book. Overall, I would say it's a kind of a forgettable story collection. I would say, unless you really care a lot about the Holly character, or and you want to read that particular novella in this, the rest is just kind of read it or not, doesn't really matter. That was If It Bleeds from Stephen King. What are your thoughts? Please let me know in the comments. Thank you for being here as always. Thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing, being amazing friends and wonderful people. I really appreciate you, and I'll see you again tomorrow. Today's word you should know sounds smart is transcendent. It is an adjective meaning going beyond normal everyday experience, existing beyond the known physical universe and its limitations. Genius means the transcendent capacity of taking trouble. Thomas Carlyle, a Scottish satirist and historian. Transcendent, Transcendent. I do not understand that quote at all. The capacity of taking trouble, is that just like a Scottish thing I don't understand?